Derringer fired its fatal round on April 14th, 1865. The clamor caused by the .44 caliber carried swiftly across the states, and the news of the attack ultimately made its way here to Sonoma County. It had immediate repercussions. Who was attacked? None other than Abraham Lincoln. Major James Armstrong stood on the porch of his D Street home in Petaluma. He had just received word of the attack, and he addressed the men before him. Those treacherous Southern sympathizers have gone too far. The furtherance of their agenda must cease, and the inflammatory remarks published in the Press Democrat must be put to an end. In the days following the surrender of Ulysses Robert E. Lee, the inflammatory rhetoric between Santa Rosa's Democrat newspaper and the Petaluma Argus began to heat up. Santa Rosa was aligned with the South, and they were clearly upset with how the war turned out. And when the news of the attack on President Lincoln reached the Union sympathizers in Petaluma, it was clear that a red line had been crossed. Jim Smith was a founding member of Petaluma's Firemen Brigade. It was Petaluma's militia. He looked up from the dusty ground. Major Armstrong, what do we do now? Major Armstrong replied, Now we gather up the rest of the men, and tonight we burn Santa Rosa to the ground. You get the rest of the men together and meet up at the Washoe house in 2 hours. Jim Smith turned around. You heard the Major. Move out. Later that evening, the cool fog began to fill the sky. It dwarfed the eucalyptus trees in the countryside, and it changed from a silver color where it passed in front of the almost full moon to a much more ominous shade of gray, almost as black as death itself. The men, too, moved silently that night as they approached their rendezvous point. As they walked through the doors of the Washoe house, Major Armstrong, Jim Smith, and the rest of the men were handed a mug of a golden-colored beer called the California Common. As the men waited on what might be the last meal of their lives, sliced brisket and boiled red potatoes, they sipped their beers and they considered their approach. We must attack from the east. That's the only way we're going to get them, said one man. No. We must attack from the west. They'd consider an attack from the east. They'd figure that out, replied another man. It was clear that there was a lot to consider. So like perhaps many other men in their same situation might do. They refilled their mugs with more beer. It was clear that everybody was thinking about the attack on Santa Rosa that night. But all the men shared the same thought. Boy, this beer is really good. So they drank and they talked, and the hours and the pints flew by. There came a tipping point where the men, with their bellies full of suds and spuds, began to discuss matters other than the attack on Santa Rosa. A few of them started to play darts. Others began to arm wrestle. Well, the hours continued to fly by, and it wasn't long before the cocks in the countryside began to crow. The sun was coming up, and the first few of the men stumbled back home to their worried wives in Petaluma. Now, of course, word spread like wildfire amongst the wives, and the first group of them showed up just after sunrise. And they found their men there, tired and loaded. One by one, they brought their men home. and thus they ended the Battle of Washoe House, which is less an actual battle, and it's more of a story of how Santa Rosa was saved by beer.